In the polished boardroom of Meridian Financial, where power lunches cost more than most people's monthly rent, CEO Victoria Sterling had built an empire on the simple principle that money could buy anything, including the illusion of physical dominance. Her personal trainer, Jake the Hammer Rodriguez, stood beside her like a trophy, his championship belt gleaming under the conference room lights as she addressed the room full of executives with the casual arrogance of someone who had never truly been challenged. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria announced, her voice cutting through the expensive air with surgical precision, I've just accomplished what most of you could only dream of. Yesterday, I lasted 3 full rounds with Jake here, a former Golden Gloves champion. Not bad for a 42-year-old CEO who spends most of her time behind a desk. The assembled executives murmured their impressed approval, though whether genuine or calculated, it was impossible to tell in a room where careers were made and destroyed by the whims of the woman at the head of the table. Victoria Sterling wasn't just wealthy. She was Riverview City's youngest self-made billionaire, a woman who had clawed her way from a middle-class background to commanding a financial empire worth over $3 billion. Her penthouse office overlooked the harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed like toys, and her personal gym occupied an entire floor of the Meridian Tower, complete with Olympic-grade equipment and round-the-clock professional trainers. She collected experiences the way other people collected stamps, skydiving certifications, black belts in disciplines she'd mastered in expensive private sessions, trophies from charity tennis tournaments where her donations guaranteed favorable matchups. But boxing had become her latest obsession, and Jake Rodriguez was her crowning achievement. The 34-year-old former professional boxer had been struggling to make ends meet after a career-ending shoulder injury when Victoria offered him a contract that would solve all his financial problems in exchange for making her look good in the ring. Their carefully choreographed sparring sessions had become the stuff of corporate legend, with Victoria regularly boasting about her natural talent and killer instinct to anyone who would listen. The thing about boxing, Victoria continued, warming to her favorite subject, is that it reveals character. It strips away all the pretense and shows you what someone is really made of. Some people crumble under pressure, and others rise to become champions. It's really quite simple. She gestured toward Jake, who nodded dutifully, his expression professionally neutral despite the uncomfortable reality of their arrangement. The executives around the table included some of Riverview City's most influential figures: bank presidents, real estate moguls, and investment firm partners who had learned to navigate Victoria's ego with the skill of diplomats walking through a minefield. They knew that challenging her directly was career suicide, but they also knew that her boxing boasts had become increasingly elaborate with each passing month. What had started as casual mentions of her training regimen had evolved into detailed accounts of imaginary victories over opponents who existed only in her carefully constructed fantasy. "I've been thinking," Victoria said, her eyes gleaming with the kind of dangerous confidence that preceded her most spectacular business conquests, "it might be time to test these skills against someone a bit more challenging than Jake here. Not that Jake isn't excellent," she added quickly, shooting a look at her trainer that reminded everyone in the room exactly who signed the paychecks. "But I'm ready for a real opponent, someone who doesn't know enough to hold back." The suggestion sent a ripple of barely concealed concern through the room. Victoria's sparring sessions with Jake were carefully controlled affairs, more theater than genuine combat, designed to maintain the illusion of her boxing prowess without any real risk of injury or embarrassment. The idea of her facing an actual opponent who might not play along with the charade was the kind of scenario that kept her public relations team awake at night. Margaret Chen, Victoria's head of communications and one of the few people brave enough to occasionally voice dissent, cleared her throat diplomatically. "Victoria, I'm not sure that's the best idea from a liability standpoint. Insurance concerns, potential injury, public relations implications if something were to go wrong." "Nonsense," Victoria dismissed with a wave of her hand. "I didn't build this company by avoiding risks. Besides, what could possibly go wrong? I've been training with a professional fighter for 8 months. I know what I'm doing." The confidence in her voice was absolute, backed by 8 months of carefully orchestrated victories that had convinced her that her purchased skills were genuine achievements. Jake shifted uncomfortably beside her, caught between his professional obligations and the growing certainty that Victoria's boxing delusions were about to collide spectacularly with reality. He had seen real fighters, had felt the devastating power of authentic boxing talent, and knew that Victoria's choreographed sessions bore no resemblance to actual combat. But his contract included strict confidentiality clauses that made speaking up both professionally and financially impossible. In fact, Victoria continued, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had made her legendary in hostile takeover negotiations. "I think we should make this interesting. A public demonstration of what dedication and proper training can achieve. Maybe we could set up something at the Harbor Club's charity gala next month. A little exhibition match to show everyone what's possible when you commit to excellence." The Harbor Club was Riverview City's most exclusive social venue, where membership cost more than most people's houses, and where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. A boxing exhibition there would guarantee maximum visibility and social media coverage. Exactly the kind of high-stakes public forum where Victoria's boxing fantasy would either be validated or spectacularly destroyed. But Victoria Sterling had no idea that 3 blocks away from her gleaming corporate tower, in a rundown apartment above Chen's Corner Market, single mother Daniel Smith was struggling with challenges that made Victoria's manufactured obstacles look like luxury problems. Daniel had spent 8 years as a military combat instructor, training elite soldiers in hand-to-hand combat techniques that had kept them alive in the world's most dangerous places. But civilian life had proven more challenging than any battlefield she'd faced, and her expertise in combat had translated poorly to the corporate world that valued connections over competence. As Victoria basked in the approval of her bought and paid-for audience, she had no way of knowing that her casual boast about wanting a real opponent was about to connect her with someone whose military training and desperate circumstances would turn her carefully constructed boxing fantasy into a very real nightmare. The collision course was set, though neither woman yet realized that their worlds were about to intersect in ways that would shatter everything Victoria thought she knew about strength, skill, and the difference between purchased confidence and earned capability. The stage was set for an encounter that would prove that sometimes the most devastating opponents come from the most unexpected places, and that authentic strength often wears the disguise of quiet desperation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Danielle Smith stood at the bathroom mirror of her cramped 2-bedroom apartment, carefully covering the fresh bruise on her left cheekbone with concealer that cost more than she could afford, but less than missing another job interview. At 29, she carried herself with the precise posture of someone whose military training had become muscle memory, but her civilian clothes, a department store blazer that had seen better days and shoes resold twice, told a different story about her current circumstances. The apartment above Chen's Corner Market wasn't much, but it was home for Daniel and her 7-year-old daughter Emma, who sat at their tiny kitchen table working on homework with the focused determination of a child who had learned early that chaos could be managed through careful attention to controllable details. The walls were thin enough that they could hear Mrs. Chen's television downstairs, and the heating worked sporadically, but the rent was affordable, and the landlady was patient about late payments when Daniel's irregular income hit rough patches. "Mom, are you going to another job interview?" Emma asked without looking up from her math worksheet, her dark hair falling across her face in a way that reminded Daniel painfully of Emma's father, who had died in a training accident when Emma was barely 2 years old. "Something like that, sweetheart," Daniel replied, though the crumpled newspaper classified section on the counter told a more complicated story. She had circled every remotely suitable position in red ink, but most required experience she didn't have, or paid wages that wouldn't cover their basic expenses. Corporate security positions wanted college degrees in fields she'd never studied. Administrative roles required software skills that the military hadn't taught her. Even warehouse jobs seemed to prefer candidates without what one interviewer had diplomatically called her overqualification problem. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel that she could disarm 3 opponents simultaneously, navigate hostile territory in complete darkness, and had once single-handedly neutralized a terrorist cell in Afghanistan. But she couldn't figure out how to translate those skills into civilian employment that paid enough to provide Emma with the stability every child deserved. The military had taught her to adapt and overcome any obstacle, but civilian bureaucracy operated by rules that seemed designed to exclude people with her particular expertise. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos, her only real friend in Riverview City, and a fellow veteran who had managed to land a job as a fitness instructor at the Harbor Club through a combination of persistence and what she called strategic networking with people who had never heard actual gunfire. The message was brief but intriguing. Emergency coverage needed at Harbor Club. Rich lady needs boxing partner. Pays $200 for 2 hours. Interested? Daniel read the message twice, calculating quickly. $200 would cover Emma's school lunch account for the next month, with enough left over for the heating bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. The Harbor Club was the kind of place where Daniel would normally never set foot, a gleaming monument to inherited wealth and purchased privilege, where membership cost more than she'd made in the past 6 months combined. She texted back, "What's the catch?" Maria's response came immediately. "Some CEO thinks she's a boxer. Needs sparring partner for serious training session. Regular trainer called in sick. They're desperate. Just show up and let her feel tough. Easy money." Daniel stared at the message, torn between desperation and dignity. She had spent 8 years training soldiers who faced life-and-death situations where half measures meant casualties, where authentic skill was the difference between coming home alive and being shipped back in a flag-draped coffin. The idea of participating in some wealthy woman's fantasy felt like a betrayal of everything she'd learned about real combat. But Emma's math tutor cost $60 a week, money that Daniel couldn't consistently provide despite her daughter's obvious talent with numbers. Emma never complained when they had to skip sessions, never mentioned that her classmates had advantages she didn't, never made Daniel feel guilty about the opportunities she couldn't provide. That quiet acceptance was somehow worse than protests would have been. "Mom," Emma said, looking up from her homework with the serious expression she wore when discussing adult matters, "Mrs. Chen said her nephew might have work for you at his restaurant. It's just washing dishes, but it's steady." The offer was kindly meant, but Daniel had already inquired. The restaurant job paid minimum wage for maximum hours, and the schedule would require Emma to spend evenings alone in the apartment, a situation that violated everything Daniel believed about responsible parenting. She had seen too many military families destroyed by deployments that pulled parents away from children who needed stability and presence. Daniel's laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, its screen displaying her bank balance, $127.43. Rent was due in 6 days. Emma needed new shoes. Her current pair was held together with superglue and determination. The refrigerator contained enough food for maybe 4 more meals if Daniel got creative with rice and whatever vegetables were marked down at the corner market. She looked at Maria's text message again, weighing pride against necessity. The Harbor Club represented everything she found distasteful about civilian privilege. Wealthy people buying experiences they hadn't earned, playing at skills that others had paid for with blood and sacrifice. But Emma's quiet acceptance of their circumstances was a constant reminder that Daniel's principles were a luxury they couldn't afford when her daughter's security was at stake. "I might have some work this afternoon," Daniel told Emma, making the decision that felt both inevitable and slightly shameful. "Mrs. Chen said she'd keep an eye on you until I get back." Emma nodded solemnly, already accustomed to the irregular schedule that characterized their life. "Will it pay enough for the heating bill?" she asked, with the financial awareness that no 7-year-old should need to possess. "Maybe," Daniel replied, "though $200 would do more than cover the heating bill. It would provide the kind of financial breathing room they hadn't experienced in months, enough to let Emma be a child instead of a small partner in economic survival." Daniel texted Maria back, "When and where?" The response included an address that Daniel recognized as the most expensive part of Riverside City's waterfront district, along with instructions to use the service entrance and ask for Jake Rodriguez. The arrangement felt appropriately demeaning. She would enter through the back door to provide entertainment for people who had never faced real challenges, never experienced the kind of desperation that made swallowing pride feel like a reasonable trade for financial stability. As Daniel changed into the only athletic clothes she owned, military-issue workout gear that had seen better days but still functioned perfectly, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back had the lean muscle definition of someone whose fitness wasn't about appearance but capability, whose training had been measured in survival rather than aesthetics. The bruise on her cheekbone was from Emma's elbow during a bedtime wrestling match, not combat, but it served as a reminder that even play fighting with her daughter was more authentic than whatever performance she was about to provide at the Harbor Club. The train ride across town gave Daniel time to prepare mentally for whatever awaited her. She had learned to compartmentalize during her military service, to separate personal feelings from professional requirements. Today would be another mission, with different objectives but the same fundamental approach. Assess the situation, adapt to circumstances, complete the assignment, collect payment, return home safely. But as the Harbor Club's gleaming towers came into view through the train window, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this particular mission might prove more complicated than a simple afternoon of manufactured combat with someone's boxing delusions. Something about the urgency in Maria's messages, the unusually high payment for what should have been routine work, suggested circumstances that hadn't been fully explained. The service entrance led through a maze of corridors that reminded Daniel uncomfortably of the military installations where she'd spent the best years of her adult life. But instead of leading to training facilities designed for life and death preparation, these halls led to a playground for people who had never faced consequences more serious than social embarrassment or financial inconvenience. Whatever awaited her beyond those polished doors, Daniel was about to discover that some encounters change everything, and that desperate single mothers sometimes possessed exactly the skills that wealthy, delusional CEOs needed to learn lessons they never intended to receive. The Harbor Club's service entrance opened into a world that Daniel had only glimpsed in movies. Polished marble floors that reflected overhead crystal chandeliers, mahogany-paneled walls adorned with oil paintings of long-dead aristocrats, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that only existed in places where money had accumulated for generations. The contrast with her cramped apartment was so stark it felt like stepping through a portal into an alternate reality, where financial stress didn't exist, and children didn't need to worry about heating bills. Jake Rodriguez met her at the service desk, and Daniel immediately recognized the familiar posture of a fellow fighter, not the theatrical aggression that amateurs often displayed, but the relaxed alertness of someone who had actually stepped into rings where outcomes weren't predetermined. His handshake was firm without being performative, and his eyes carried the kind of weariness that suggested complicated circumstances behind his presence in this temple of privilege. "Maria said you have combat experience," Jake said quietly, leading her through corridors lined with photographs of Harbor Club members receiving awards from each other in an endless cycle of mutual recognition. "Real experience, not the kind they teach in weekend self-defense classes." "8 years military," Daniel replied, her voice automatically dropping to the professional tone she'd used when briefing superior officers. "Hand-to-hand combat instruction, close-quarters battle training, defensive tactics for high-risk environments." She paused, studying Jake's expression for signs of the skepticism she'd encountered from civilian instructors who assumed military training was all discipline and no technique. "What exactly am I walking into here?" Jake stopped at a set of double doors marked "Private Gym, Members Only," and turned to face her with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed desperation. "Victoria Sterling thinks she's a boxer. 8 months of carefully managed sparring sessions have convinced her that she's developed genuine fighting skills. My regular partner called in sick, and Victoria has a potential sponsor coming to watch her train this afternoon, someone who might invest in her idea for a women's boxing league." The situation was starting to make sense in ways that made Daniel deeply uncomfortable. "And you need me to make her look good for this sponsor." "That's what I thought when I called Maria," Jake admitted, running a hand through his hair with the gesture of someone who had spent considerable time wrestling with ethical compromises. "But there's a complication. The sponsor is Rebecca Walsh. She owns 3 professional gyms and managed 2 Olympic boxers. She knows real fighting when she sees it, and she's specifically coming to evaluate Victoria's actual skill level." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded complicated missions where the objectives weren't clearly defined and the parameters kept shifting. "So you need me to make your client look competent to someone who will know immediately if she's being humored." "Exactly. And here's the problem. Victoria has convinced herself that she's ready for real competition. She's been pressuring me to arrange sparring sessions with actual fighters, people who won't hold back. She thinks the reason she always wins our sessions is because she's naturally gifted, not because I'm following a script that keeps her safe and confident." The ethical dimensions of the situation were becoming clearer, and Daniel found herself calculating not just the immediate financial benefit, but the longer-term implications of participating in what amounted to an elaborate deception. Her military training had emphasized the importance of honest assessment in life-and-death situations, where overestimating capabilities led to casualties and missions that failed catastrophically. What happens when Rebecca Walsh realizes that Victoria's skills aren't what she's been led to believe? Daniel asked. Jake's expression darkened. That's what I'm hoping to avoid. If I can find someone with enough real skill to give Victoria a genuine workout without embarrassing her completely, maybe we can thread the needle. Show Rebecca that Victoria has potential while keeping Victoria's confidence intact. And if that doesn't work, then I lose the best-paying client I've ever had, Victoria loses a potentially massive investment opportunity, and Rebecca Walsh leaves thinking we're all frauds. Jake's voice carried the weight of financial pressures that Daniel recognized from her own circumstances. Look, I know how this sounds. I know it's not ideal, but Victoria isn't a bad person. She's just someone who's been insulated from failure her entire life. She genuinely believes she's worked hard for her boxing skills. Daniel thought about Emma's math tutor, about the heating bill, about the careful calculations required to make their monthly budget work even with the corners cut as tight as possible. $200 wasn't just money. It was security, stability, the difference between Emma worrying about grown-up problems and being able to focus on 7-year-old concerns like homework and playground friendships. Show me the training setup, Daniel said finally, making the decision that felt both pragmatic and ethically complicated. The private gym occupied an entire floor of the Harbor Club, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed like toys in a bathtub. The boxing area featured a professional-grade ring, heavy bags that had clearly been used for aesthetic purposes rather than serious training, and equipment that looked like it had been purchased by someone who valued appearance over functionality. Jake led her through a quick tour, pointing out the various stations where Victoria had been training for the past 8 months. Daniel recognized immediately that the setup was designed for safety and spectacle rather than genuine skill development. The heavy bags were positioned to minimize the risk of injury from missed punches. The ring had extra padding that would absorb impact from falls, and even the gloves were a lighter weight than what serious boxers used for sparring. She's been working with a choreographed routine, Jake explained, demonstrating some of the combinations that Victoria had mastered. Left jab, right cross, left hook, step back and reset. It looks impressive if you don't know what real boxing footwork should look like, but it's basically a dance routine with gloves on. Daniel watched Jake's demonstration with the analytical eye she'd developed during years of evaluating combat readiness in soldiers whose lives would depend on their training. The movements were technically correct, but lacked the fluid adaptability that real fighting required. They were performed rather than applied, rehearsed rather than reactive. What does she think is going to happen when she faces someone who doesn't follow the script? Daniel asked. That's the problem. She doesn't realize there is a script. In her mind, she's been defeating a professional boxer through superior technique and natural talent. She's talking about entering amateur competitions, maybe even exhibition matches with other businesswomen who think they can fight. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the gym, accompanied by voices that carried the confident authority of people accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Daniel felt her military training automatically engage, assessing exits, evaluating potential threats, cataloging the tactical aspects of an environment that most people would see as merely luxurious. That's Victoria, Jake said quietly, his posture straightening into the professional demeanor of someone whose paycheck depended on managing difficult personalities. Remember, she's expecting a serious training session that will demonstrate her readiness for advanced competition. Rebecca Walsh will be watching for any sign that this is performance rather than genuine skill assessment. Daniel nodded, understanding that the next hour would require the kind of careful balance she'd learned during diplomatic missions, where military objectives had to be achieved through political subtlety rather than direct action. Too much authenticity would shatter Victoria's confidence and expose Jake's choreographed training regimen. Too little would fail to satisfy Rebecca Walsh's professional evaluation. The voices grew closer, and Daniel could make out Victoria's tone, the kind of confident authority that came from never having been seriously challenged, never having faced situations where competence was measured in survival rather than profit margins. This was someone who had purchased excellence in every other area of her life and genuinely believed that boxing skills could be acquired through the same combination of expensive instruction and determined effort. As the gym doors opened to admit Victoria Sterling and her entourage, Daniel realized that the next hour would determine not just whether she earned the money Emma needed, but whether she could navigate the ethical complexities of a situation where honest assessment might destroy someone's dreams, while deception enabled potentially dangerous delusions. The stage was set for an encounter that would test everything Daniel had learned about balancing authentic skill with diplomatic necessity, and whether real combat experience could be disguised enough to serve the competing needs of financial desperation and professional integrity. Victoria Sterling entered the private gym like a conquering general surveying her domain, her custom-fitted boxing gear proclaiming both serious intent and unlimited budget. Her entourage included Rebecca Walsh, a compact woman in her 50s whose scarred knuckles and calculating gaze immediately marked her as someone who had earned her reputation in actual rings rather than boardrooms, along with two assistants whose primary function seemed to be documenting Victoria's every movement with professional cameras. Daniel's first impression was that Victoria moved with the confidence of someone who had never been genuinely tested, her footwork precise but mechanical, lacking the fluid adaptability that came from facing unpredictable opponents. Everything about her preparation suggested expensive instruction focused on technique rather than application, form rather than function. "Jake, I see you found someone new," Victoria said, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward Daniel with the kind of practiced charm that suggested years of networking events and carefully managed social interactions. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I understand you have some boxing experience?" "Some," Daniel replied carefully, accepting the handshake and noting immediately that Victoria's grip, while firm, lacked the calloused strength that came from years of actual training. "I'm looking forward to working with you." Rebecca Walsh stepped forward with the no-nonsense directness of someone whose time was valuable and whose expertise wasn't easily impressed. "Victoria's been telling me about her progress over the past 8 months. Says she's ready to start competing against serious opposition. That's why I'm here. To see if her training has produced the kind of skills that would justify investment in her boxing league concept." The weight of expectations settled over the gym like a heavy blanket, with Victoria clearly expecting validation of her perceived abilities, and Rebecca obviously prepared to render professional judgment based on what she observed. Daniel found herself caught between competing loyalties: her immediate need for the payment Jake had promised, her instinctive respect for honest assessment, and her growing understanding that the situation was more complicated than a simple sparring session. "Let's start with some basic combinations," Jake suggested, moving to set up the session with the kind of careful orchestration that Daniel was beginning to recognize as his signature approach. "Victoria, why don't you show our guests some of the techniques you've been mastering?" Victoria moved to the center of the ring with obvious pride, her stance technically correct, but somehow lacking the organic balance that real fighters developed through countless hours of adaptation to resistance. She began with the combination Jake had demonstrated earlier: left jab, right cross, left hook, executing each movement with the precision of someone who had memorized a sequence rather than internalized a fighting system. Daniel watched with the analytical eye she'd developed during years of evaluating combat readiness, noting immediately that Victoria's punches, while properly formed, carried no real power and were thrown at predetermined targets rather than reactive responses to an opponent's movements. This was shadow boxing elevated to performance art, technically impressive to untrained observers, but fundamentally disconnected from the chaotic reality of actual combat. "Very nice form," Rebecca commented, though her tone suggested professional assessment rather than enthusiasm. "Now let's see how those techniques work against active resistance. Daniel, would you mind providing some light sparring pressure?" This was the moment Daniel had been dreading. The point where choreographed demonstration would have to transition into genuine interaction, where Victoria's rehearsed combinations would encounter the unpredictable dynamics of an opponent who couldn't be scripted. Jake's expression carried a mixture of hope and anxiety as he helped both women with their protective gear, clearly uncertain whether his carefully constructed training regimen would survive contact with authentic resistance. Daniel approached the center of the ring with the measured caution she'd learned during diplomatic missions, where the wrong move could escalate tensions beyond control. Her strategy was to provide just enough genuine resistance to satisfy Rebecca's professional eye, while avoiding the kind of authentic pressure that would expose the fundamental limitations of Victoria's training. The first exchange was revealing in ways that Daniel doubted Victoria understood. Victoria threw her practiced left jab with confident precision, but when Daniel moved slightly to the side, a basic defensive reaction that any real opponent would employ, Victoria's follow-up combination fell apart completely. The right cross that should have followed landed in empty air, and the left hook that completed her sequence struck nothing but Daniel's raised glove. "Interesting," Rebecca murmured, making notes on a tablet with the clinical detachment of someone documenting technical deficiencies. "Victoria, try adapting your combinations when your opponent moves. Real fighters don't stand still while you work through your routine." Victoria's second attempt showed marginal improvement, but Daniel could see the confusion in her eyes as she realized that her 8 months of training hadn't prepared her for opponents who didn't cooperate with her predetermined sequences. When Daniel threw a gentle counterpunch, barely more than a tap designed to test Victoria's defensive reflexes, Victoria's response was awkward and off balance, suggesting that all her training had been offensive rather than reactive. "Let's increase the intensity slightly," Rebecca suggested, her professional curiosity clearly engaged by the gap between Victoria's confident expectations and her actual performance under pressure. "Daniel, give her something that requires genuine defensive response." Daniel found herself in an impossible position, caught between the competing demands of honest assessment and diplomatic necessity. Too much intensity would expose Victoria's limitations completely, potentially destroying her confidence and Jake's employment situation. Too little would fail to satisfy Rebecca's evaluation and might result in dangerous overconfidence if Victoria proceeded with her competition plans. She chose a middle path, throwing combinations that were genuine but controlled, providing enough pressure to test Victoria's skills without overwhelming her completely. The results were illuminating. Victoria could execute her rehearsed techniques competently when given time and space, but struggled significantly when required to adapt to changing circumstances or respond to incoming attacks. After 10 minutes of increasingly revealing exchanges, Rebecca called for a break, her expression suggesting that she had seen enough to form preliminary conclusions. Victoria was breathing heavily, her perfect hair disheveled, and her confidence visibly shaken by the realization that real sparring was significantly more demanding than her previous training sessions. "How do you think I did?" Victoria asked Rebecca with the eager anxiety of someone whose self-image was suddenly uncertain. Rebecca's response was diplomatically honest. "You've obviously received quality technical instruction and your form is quite good, but there's a significant difference between executing techniques in isolation and applying them under pressure against unpredictable opposition. Real competition would require considerably more adaptive training." Daniel watched Victoria process this feedback, seeing the exact moment when 8 months of carefully maintained confidence collided with the reality of authentic assessment. The expression on Victoria's face shifted from expectation to confusion, to something approaching recognition that her perceived mastery might have been an elaborate illusion. "Perhaps we should continue the session," Victoria said with the determined optimism of someone refusing to accept unwelcome evidence. "I'm sure I just need to warm up more thoroughly." But Daniel could see in Rebecca's eyes that the professional evaluation was essentially complete. The gap between Victoria's expectations and her actual capabilities was too significant to bridge with minor adjustments or additional warm-up time. What Victoria needed wasn't more sparring. It was months or years of genuine training against opponents who wouldn't accommodate her choreographed combinations. As they prepared for the second round, Daniel realized that the situation had moved beyond simple financial transaction into something more complex and potentially dangerous. Victoria's confidence in her abilities, while clearly misplaced, was absolute, and people with that kind of delusional certainty sometimes made decisions that could have serious consequences when reality finally intruded. The next phase of their sparring session would determine whether Victoria could accept honest feedback about her limitations, or whether she would choose to interpret any evidence that contradicted her self-image as simply requiring more aggressive demonstration of her perceived skills. The second round began with Victoria's movements noticeably more aggressive, her frustration with the previous exchange translating into harder punches and more forceful combinations. Daniel could sense the shift immediately. Victoria was no longer content with demonstration, she was trying to prove something, and that kind of emotional fighting was dangerous for everyone involved. When someone with limited skills but unlimited confidence decided to escalate intensity, the potential for serious injury increased exponentially. Daniel adapted her defensive strategy accordingly, focusing on deflection and distance management rather than counterattacks. but Victoria's increasing aggression was making the choreographed approach impossible to maintain. Each exchange revealed more clearly that Victoria's 8 months of training had created a dangerous combination: enough technical knowledge to throw powerful punches, but insufficient experience to understand when and how to control them. "Much better energy," Rebecca observed, though her tone suggested professional concern rather than approval. "Victoria, remember that boxing is about precision and timing, not just power. You're telegraphing your intentions and leaving yourself open to counters." But Victoria seemed beyond listening to technical advice. Her focus narrowed to the immediate goal of landing decisive blows that would validate her perception of her abilities. When Daniel stepped aside from a particularly wild right cross, Victoria's momentum carried her forward in a way that would have been catastrophic against an opponent with less restraint. The session was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Blackmore, the Harbor Club's general manager, whose expression carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news to people whose displeasure could have significant consequences. He approached the ring with the measured steps of a diplomatic messenger, clearly reluctant to interrupt, but compelled by circumstances beyond his control. "Ms. Sterling," Thomas said with the practiced deference that expensive club memberships commanded, "I apologize for the interruption, but we've received some concerns from other members about the intensity of today's training session. The noise level has exceeded what our membership agreement typically allows for private gym usage." Victoria's face flushed with anger that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Noise level? This is a gym, Thomas. Gyms are supposed to have noise. What exactly are these members complaining about?" "Well," Thomas continued with obvious discomfort, "several members have expressed concern about what they perceive as aggressive sparring taking place in the private facility. The Harbor Club's insurance policy has specific restrictions regarding contact sports, and there are questions about whether today's activities fall within approved parameters." Rebecca Walsh stepped forward with the authority of someone whose professional reputation was being questioned by bureaucratic concerns. "I can assure you that this is a legitimate boxing evaluation session conducted according to standard safety protocols. Ms. Sterling is wearing appropriate protective gear, and the sparring is well within normal training parameters." But Thomas's expression suggested that the concerns went beyond simple insurance technicalities. "The issue isn't the legitimacy of the training, Ms. Walsh. The issue is that the Harbor Club wasn't designed to accommodate this level of combat activity. Several members have contacted the board of directors, and there are questions about whether Ms. Sterling's boxing activities are compatible with the club's traditional atmosphere." Daniel recognized the political dynamics at play. Victoria's boxing obsession was creating problems that extended beyond her personal training regimen into the broader social ecosystem of the Harbor Club. Wealthy members who had joined for golf, tennis, and networking were uncomfortable with the sounds and implications of actual combat taking place in their sanctuary of refined leisure. "Who specifically complained?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the dangerous edge of someone accustomed to identifying and eliminating sources of opposition. "I'd like to speak with them directly about their concerns." Thomas's diplomatic training was clearly being tested by Victoria's confrontational approach. "Ms. Sterling, I'm not at liberty to identify specific members, but I can tell you that the concerns come from multiple sources and have reached the level of formal board discussion. There will likely be a review of the private gym usage policies as a result of today's activities." The implications were clear. Victoria's boxing aspirations were creating institutional resistance that could affect not just her training arrangements but her standing within the social hierarchy that the Harbor Club represented. Daniel could see Victoria calculating the political costs of her boxing activities, weighing her athletic ambitions against her need to maintain influence within Riverview City's elite social circles. "This is ridiculous," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the frustrated authority of someone whose will was rarely questioned. "I pay more in annual dues than most people make in a year. The idea that I can't use the facilities I'm paying for because some members are uncomfortable with the sound of legitimate athletic training is completely unacceptable." But Rebecca's expression suggested that the institutional resistance was more significant than simple member complaints. "Victoria, this kind of opposition often reflects deeper concerns about liability and insurance. If the club's board decides that boxing activities pose unacceptable risks, they could ban combat sports entirely, regardless of your membership status or financial contributions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Chen, Victoria's head of communications, whose urgent expression suggested that the day's complications were expanding beyond the immediate gym environment. She approached the group with the hurried efficiency of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously, her tablet already displaying what appeared to be social media feeds and news alerts. "Victoria, we have a problem," Margaret announced without preamble. "Someone's been recording today's training session from outside the building. There are videos circulating on social media that show you sparring, and the commentary isn't favorable." Daniel felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. If videos of the session were already online, her involvement in what might be perceived as a publicity stunt could affect her future employment prospects, particularly if the recordings made it appear that she was participating in some kind of staged demonstration rather than legitimate training. "What kind of commentary?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would be unwelcome. Margaret turned her tablet to show a Twitter feed that included short video clips of the sparring session, accompanied by comments that ranged from skeptical to openly mocking. The recordings, taken through the gym's floor-to-ceiling windows, clearly showed Victoria's awkward responses to Daniel's controlled attacks, creating a visual narrative that undermined Victoria's claims of boxing competence. The general consensus seems to be that you're either being humored by your sparring partner or that your boxing skills aren't as developed as you've been claiming, Margaret reported with the clinical directness that public relations crises required. There are questions about whether this is legitimate training or some kind of performance designed for social media promotion. Rebecca Walsh examined the tablet with the professional interest of someone whose expertise was being indirectly challenged by public speculation. "The video quality isn't good enough to judge technique accurately, but the optics are problematic. It looks like Victoria is struggling against relatively light pressure, which contradicts the narrative of advanced skill development." Victoria's response was immediate and defensive. "The optics are problematic because people don't understand what they're seeing. Real boxing training involves learning to handle pressure and resistance. Of course it looks difficult. That's the point. That's how you develop real skills." But Daniel could see that the social media exposure had created a new layer of complications that extended far beyond the immediate training session. Victoria's reputation as a successful businesswoman was now entangled with her boxing aspirations, in ways that could affect her corporate credibility and social standing within Riverview City's elite community. The combination of institutional resistance from the Harbor Club, social media scrutiny, and questions about the legitimacy of her training regimen was creating a perfect storm of pressure that threatened to expose the fundamental disconnect between Victoria's boxing ambitions and her actual capabilities. Daniel realized that she was no longer just a hired sparring partner. She had become an unwilling participant in a public relations crisis that could have consequences for everyone involved. As the various stakeholders gathered around Margaret's tablet to examine the social media coverage, Daniel understood that the afternoon's complications were just the beginning of a much larger conflict between Victoria's self-image and the reality that authentic assessment would inevitably reveal. The following weeks transformed Victoria's boxing obsession from private eccentricity into public spectacle, with each training session drawing larger crowds of curious Harbor Club members who gathered outside the gym windows like spectators at a zoo. What had begun as discreet whispers about unusual noise levels evolved into open fascination with the CEO, who believed she could fight, creating a social dynamic that fed Victoria's determination while simultaneously undermining her credibility. Daniel found herself returning to the Harbor Club 3 times a week, her initial desperation for the $200 payment having evolved into something more complex and financially significant. Victoria had increased the session fees to $300 per visit, ostensibly to compensate for the additional scrutiny and social pressure, but Daniel suspected the real motivation was Victoria's growing need to validate her investment through measurable progress. The improvements were undeniable, though not in ways that Victoria fully understood. Her footwork had become more fluid, her defensive reflexes noticeably sharper, and her ability to adapt to changing circumstances during sparring had developed from completely absent to marginally functional. But these gains represented progress from absolute beginner to competent amateur, not the journey from novice to potential competitor that Victoria's confidence suggested. "I can feel the difference," Victoria announced after a particularly intense session that had left both women breathing heavily. "The combinations are becoming instinctive. My timing is improving. Jake says I'm developing the kind of ring awareness that can't be taught. It either emerges naturally or it doesn't. Daniel nodded diplomatically while toweling off, though her professional assessment was considerably more nuanced. Victoria was indeed developing ring awareness, but it was the basic spatial consciousness that any athlete acquired after sufficient repetition, not the sophisticated combat intuition that separated competent fighters from dangerous ones. The distinction was crucial, but Daniel had learned that honesty about Victoria's limitations was neither welcome nor financially advisable. Rebecca Walsh had become a regular observer, her initial skepticism gradually shifting toward cautious interest as she witnessed Victoria's genuine dedication and measurable improvement. Her presence added legitimacy to the training sessions while creating additional pressure for results that would justify her continued attention and potential investment in Victoria's boxing league concept. "The technical foundation is definitely strengthening," Rebecca commented during one of her evaluation visits. "Victoria's punch accuracy has improved significantly, and she's starting to show genuine defensive instincts. The question is whether she can handle the psychological pressure of actual competition against opponents who haven't been specifically selected for compatibility with her skill level." The observation highlighted the central paradox of Victoria's situation. Her progress was real but relative, impressive compared to her starting point but potentially inadequate for the competitive aspirations she was developing. Daniel had seen similar patterns during military training, where soldiers showed dramatic improvement in controlled environments but struggled when those same skills were tested under genuine stress. The breakthrough moment came during a session in the 4th week, when Victoria successfully countered one of Daniel's attacks with a combination that was both technically sound and tactically appropriate. The sequence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Daniel threw a controlled left jab, Victoria slipped the punch while stepping inside, and responded with a right uppercut, followed by a left hook that caught Daniel's defensive glove with satisfying impact. "Did you see that?" Victoria exclaimed, her excitement genuine and infectious. "I read your movement, timed the counter perfectly, and executed a combination that Jake says is advanced-level technique. That's not beginner's luck. That's developed skill responding to real pressure." Daniel had to admit that the counter was legitimately impressive, executed with the kind of smooth coordination that suggested Victoria's muscle memory was indeed developing beyond basic technique into actual fighting instincts. The moment represented a genuine milestone in Victoria's progression, evidence that dedicated training could produce meaningful results even for adult beginners with no prior combat experience. But the success also reinforced Victoria's growing conviction that she was ready for more challenging opposition, that her controlled sparring sessions with Daniel represented adequate preparation for the kind of competitive boxing she was beginning to envision. Her conversations increasingly focused on amateur tournaments, exhibition matches, and the possibility of facing opponents who wouldn't provide the diplomatic resistance that characterized their training environment. "I've been thinking," Victoria said during the cool-down period after her successful counter-demonstration, "it might be time to test these skills against someone who doesn't know my patterns, someone who will provide genuine resistance without the familiarity factor that might be limiting my development." Daniel felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied tactical situations where the parameters were shifting in potentially dangerous directions. Victoria's improvement was real, but her assessment of that improvement was dangerously optimistic, creating a gap between perceived capability and actual readiness that could have serious consequences in uncontrolled environments. "That's an interesting idea," Daniel replied carefully, "but there's significant value in continuing to develop your foundation before adding the variable of unfamiliar opponents. Consistent progress with known training partners often produces better long-term results than premature exposure to unpredictable competition." But Victoria's expression suggested that her patience for gradual development was diminishing as her confidence increased. "I understand the value of systematic progression, but I also know that real improvement requires genuine challenges. I can't spend indefinitely sparring with the same partner and expect to develop the adaptability that competition demands." Rebecca Walsh, who had been observing the exchange with professional interest, stepped forward with the authority of someone whose opinion carried significant weight in Victoria's decision-making process. "Victoria raises a valid point about the need for varied opposition, but Daniel's caution is also well-founded. Perhaps we could arrange a controlled experiment, a sparring session with a different partner, but still within the safe environment of the Harbor Club." The suggestion represented a compromise that addressed Victoria's desire for new challenges while maintaining the controlled conditions that had made her progress possible. But Daniel understood that any expansion of Victoria's sparring partners would inevitably lead to comparisons that might reveal the careful management that had characterized their training relationship. "Who did you have in mind?" Victoria asked, her enthusiasm for the idea clearly outweighing any concerns about the risks involved. "There's a woman named Sarah Martinez who teaches boxing at the community center downtown," Rebecca replied. "She's got solid amateur experience and a reputation for working well with developing fighters. She might be willing to come here for a session if the compensation is appropriate." Daniel's military training immediately flagged the potential complications of introducing an unknown variable into what had been a carefully controlled environment. Sarah Martinez, unlike Daniel, would have no financial incentive to accommodate Victoria's limitations or manage her confidence diplomatically. If she approached the sparring session with the intensity that competitive amateur boxing typically required, the results could be devastating for Victoria's self-image and dangerous for her physical safety. "That sounds perfect," Victoria agreed enthusiastically. "I'd like to schedule something for next week. It'll be interesting to see how my techniques work against someone with a different fighting style, and no familiarity with my combinations." As they finalized the arrangements for what Victoria was already calling her real test, Daniel realized that the careful balance she had maintained between honest training and diplomatic accommodation was about to be shattered by forces beyond her control. Victoria's genuine improvement had created legitimate confidence, but that confidence was based on limited exposure to the full spectrum of boxing skills that actual competition would demand. The session with Sarah Martinez would either validate Victoria's belief in her developing abilities or expose the significant gaps that still existed between her current skill level and her competitive aspirations. Either outcome would fundamentally alter the dynamic that had made Daniel's involvement both financially beneficial and ethically manageable. As Victoria scheduled her upcoming challenge with obvious excitement, Daniel understood that the next phase of their training relationship would determine whether Victoria's boxing journey continued as a productive hobby or evolved into something considerably more dangerous and potentially humiliating for everyone involved. Sarah Martinez arrived at the Harbor Club on a Tuesday morning with the kind of understated confidence that immediately distinguished her from the carefully managed atmosphere that had characterized Victoria's previous training sessions. Unlike the diplomatic approach that Daniel had learned to employ, Sarah carried herself with the straightforward professionalism of someone whose boxing credentials had been earned through actual competition rather than expensive private instruction. Daniel watched from the observation area as Sarah examined the Harbor Club's boxing setup with the critical eye of someone accustomed to training in environments where function mattered more than appearance. Her assessment was swift and professional, noting the extra padding in the ring, the lighter-weight gloves, and the general configuration that prioritized safety over authentic training conditions. "Interesting setup," Sarah commented to Rebecca Walsh, who was conducting what amounted to a pre-sparring interview. "Very focused on injury prevention. That's smart for recreational training, but it doesn't really prepare fighters for standard competition conditions." Victoria, who had been stretching with the elaborate routine that Jake had taught her, looked up with obvious interest. "What do you mean by standard competition conditions?" Sarah's response was matter-of-fact rather than diplomatic. "Regulation rings have less padding, standard gloves are heavier, and the overall environment is designed to test fighters rather than protect them. Training exclusively in modified conditions can create skill gaps that become apparent when fighters transition to actual competition." The observation highlighted a fundamental issue that Daniel had been wrestling with throughout her involvement in Victoria's training: the difference between developing skills in controlled environments and preparing for the unpredictable realities that authentic competition demanded. Sarah's presence represented the first time that Victoria would face someone whose approach wasn't influenced by financial considerations or diplomatic concerns. "I think I'm ready for more realistic conditions," Victoria replied with the confidence that had been building throughout her weeks of measured progress. "That's actually why I wanted to spar with someone new, to test whether my techniques work against different fighting styles and approaches." Sarah nodded approvingly, clearly respecting Victoria's apparent willingness to face genuine challenges. That's the right attitude. Controlled training has its place, but real development requires exposure to pressure and unpredictability. How much competitive experience do you have? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable implications. highlighting the gap between Victoria's training regimen and the kind of background that serious boxers typically possessed before seeking challenging sparring partners. Daniel could see Victoria calculating her response, weighing honesty about her limited experience against her desire to be taken seriously as a developing fighter. "I've been training intensively for about 2 months, Victoria said, stretching the timeline in a way that technically included her earlier sessions with Jake while obscuring their choreographed nature. "I've been working with Daniel here on developing my technique and ring awareness. Jake says my progress has been exceptional for someone starting at my age." Sarah's expression suggested professional interest rather than skepticism, but Daniel noticed that she didn't ask follow-up questions about Victoria's specific achievements or competitive goals. Instead, she began her own warm-up routine with the efficient movements of someone whose preparation was focused on performance rather than appearance. The contrast between Sarah's warm-up and Victoria's elaborate preparation was instructive. Where Victoria's routine involved complex stretching sequences and technical drills that looked impressive but served primarily psychological functions, Sarah's preparation was minimal and purposeful. Basic movement patterns designed to activate specific muscle groups and prepare for immediate physical demands. "Ready when you are," Sarah announced after perhaps 5 minutes of preparation, her tone suggesting that extended warm-up periods weren't necessary for someone whose fitness and technique were genuinely competition-ready. Victoria spent an additional 10 minutes completing her routine, clearly nervous about the transition from controlled training to authentic sparring but determined to proceed with the test she had requested. Daniel could see the anxiety building behind Victoria's confident facade, the recognition that this session would provide information about her abilities that couldn't be managed or diplomatically interpreted. The first exchange revealed immediately that Sarah's approach was fundamentally different from Daniel's careful accommodation. When Victoria threw her practiced left jab, Sarah responded with a counter that was technically perfect but delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that competitive boxing required. Victoria's defensive reaction was awkward and insufficient, suggesting that her sparring experience with Daniel hadn't prepared her for opponents who fought back with genuine skill and timing. "Nice jab," Sarah commented, resetting her position with fluid efficiency. "Try following up with something when your opponent counters. In competition, you can't just throw single punches and expect to control the pace." The advice was technically sound but highlighted Victoria's fundamental limitation. Her training had focused on executing predetermined combinations rather than developing the reactive skills that authentic boxing demanded. When Sarah threw a simple 1-2 combination in response, Victoria's attempt to counter resulted in awkward footwork and a defensive posture that left her vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Rebecca Walsh observed the exchange with obvious professional interest, making notes that Daniel suspected reflected growing awareness of the significant gaps between Victoria's perceived abilities and her performance against legitimate opposition. The session was providing exactly the kind of authentic assessment that controlled training couldn't deliver. But the results were revealing limitations that Victoria hadn't anticipated. "Let's work on your defensive positioning," Sarah suggested after Victoria struggled to respond effectively to a basic feint. "You're telegraphing your intentions and leaving yourself open to counters. Real opponents will exploit those openings consistently." The coaching was genuine and valuable, but Daniel could see that Victoria was struggling not just with the technical demands, but with the psychological reality of facing someone whose skills genuinely exceeded her own. Her confidence, built through weeks of managed progress, was encountering the humbling experience of authentic competition for the first time. After 15 minutes of increasingly revealing exchanges, Rebecca called for a break that felt more like an intervention than a rest period. Victoria was breathing heavily. Her perfect form deteriorated by the pressure of responding to unpredictable attacks, her confidence visibly shaken by the gap between her expectations and her performance. "How do you think I'm doing?" Victoria asked Rebecca with a kind of anxious hope that suggested she already knew the answer would be unwelcome. Rebecca's response was professionally honest in ways that Victoria's previous feedback had carefully avoided. "Your technical foundation is solid, and you're obviously dedicated to improvement. But there's a significant difference between executing techniques in controlled conditions and applying them under competitive pressure. You need considerably more experience against varied opposition before considering any kind of formal competition." Victoria's face showed the exact moment when 8 weeks of carefully maintained confidence collided with authentic professional assessment. The expression shifted from expectation through confusion to something approaching recognition that her boxing journey was considerably longer and more complex than she had believed. "I think I just need more time to adjust to Sarah's fighting style," Victoria replied with the determined optimism of someone refusing to accept unwelcome evidence. "Every opponent presents different challenges. That's why this kind of training is so valuable." But Sarah's expression suggested that the issues went beyond simple adjustment to unfamiliar opposition. "Victoria, the challenges you're facing aren't style-specific. They're fundamental gaps in competitive experience that require extensive development rather than minor adaptation." Daniel watched Victoria process this feedback, understanding that the careful balance between confidence and reality that had characterized their training relationship was being permanently altered by exposure to authentic assessment. Victoria's response to this moment would determine whether her boxing aspirations evolved into realistic long-term development or intensified into potentially dangerous overcompensation. The session had revealed that Victoria's genuine improvement existed within much narrower parameters than her confidence suggested, creating a crisis of self-assessment that would require either humble acceptance of her current limitations or escalated efforts to prove that the professional evaluation was somehow incorrect. Proceed with Part 8. Without include title, make sure that each part at least 801,000 words. Write 8th from 12 part of story. Please make sure you don't do any overlapping and rewriting. Edit. The official letter arrived at Daniel's apartment on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of bureaucratic weight that immediately commanded attention. The Harbor Club letterhead was embossed in gold, and the formal language contained within carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate boxing situation into territories that Daniel's military experience had taught her to recognize as institutional warfare. "Ms. Smith," the letter began with corporate precision, "it has come to our attention that your participation in boxing activities at the Harbor Club may have exceeded the parameters of standard training sessions and entered into areas that raise significant liability concerns for our organization. Effective immediately, all sparring activities involving non-members must be suspended pending a comprehensive review of our insurance coverage and safety protocols." Daniel read the letter twice, understanding immediately that Victoria's response to Sarah Martinez's honest assessment had escalated beyond personal disappointment into institutional action designed to control the narrative around her boxing capabilities. The timing wasn't coincidental. The letter had arrived exactly 48 hours after the session that had exposed the gaps between Victoria's confidence and her actual skills. Emma looked up from her breakfast cereal with the intuitive concern that children developed when adult conversations carried undertones of crisis. "Is that about your work at the fancy gym, Mom?" "Something like that, sweetheart," Daniel replied, though the implications were considerably more complex than employment issues. The letter effectively banned her from the Harbor Club while creating a paper trail that could be used to justify Victoria's boxing struggles as the result of inadequate training partners rather than fundamental skill limitations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake Rodriguez. "Emergency meeting. Can you come in today? Situation is getting complicated." Daniel's military training automatically engaged, recognizing the patterns of institutional pressure that typically preceded more serious complications. Someone with significant influence was orchestrating a campaign to reshape the narrative around Victoria's boxing development, and Daniel's role as the primary sparring partner made her a natural target for responsibility deflection. The Harbor Club felt different when Daniel arrived through the service entrance, the familiar luxury now carrying an undercurrent of hostility that made her hyper-aware of her status as an outsider whose presence was no longer welcome. Thomas Blackmore met her at the employee entrance with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed institutional disapproval. "Miss Smith, thank you for coming in despite the circumstances," Thomas said with diplomatic formality. "There are some issues we need to discuss regarding your recent training sessions with Ms. Sterling." Jake was waiting in a small conference room that Daniel had never seen before, his expression carrying the defeated resignation of someone whose carefully constructed professional situation was collapsing beyond his ability to control. Beside him sat a woman in an expensive suit whose presence immediately marked her as legal counsel rather than Harbor Club staff. "Daniel, this is Amanda Richardson from the club's legal department," Jake said without his usual warmth. "There have been some concerns raised about the training methods we've been using, and the club wants to document everyone's understanding of what's been happening over the past few weeks." Amanda Richardson opened a folder with the kind of systematic precision that suggested this conversation had been carefully planned and legally reviewed. Ms. Smith, we understand that you've been providing boxing instruction to Ms. Sterling over the past several weeks. We'd like to clarify the nature of that instruction and your qualifications to provide it. The question was phrased with careful neutrality, but Daniel recognized immediately that her answer could be used to either validate or undermine Victoria's training regimen. If she emphasized her military combat experience, it could support claims that Victoria had received legitimate instruction. If she minimized her qualifications, it could justify arguments that Victoria's lack of progress resulted from inadequate coaching. I provided sparring services, Daniel replied carefully, understanding that precision of language would be crucial in whatever legal framework was being constructed. Ms. Sterling requested training partners who could provide resistance during her boxing practice sessions. And what specific qualifications do you possess for providing boxing instruction? Amanda continued, her tone suggesting that the answer would be measured against predetermined standards that Daniel couldn't anticipate. Daniel's military training had included extensive hand-to-hand combat instruction, but translating those credentials into civilian boxing qualifications was complicated by the different standards and certifications that applied to recreational sports instruction. I have 8 years of military combat training, including hand-to-hand combat instruction and defensive tactics. I was certified to train other soldiers in close-quarters battle techniques. Amanda made notes with the clinical detachment of someone documenting information that would be analyzed later for strategic purposes. Were you ever informed that Ms. Sterling was preparing for competitive boxing rather than recreational fitness training? The question revealed the direction of the legal strategy, establishing that Daniel had been misled about Victoria's intentions and therefore couldn't be held responsible for training methods that might have been inappropriate for someone with competitive aspirations. Daniel realized that she was being positioned as either an unwitting participant in Victoria's delusions or a negligent instructor who had failed to provide adequate preparation for competitive boxing. Ms. Sterling expressed interest in developing her boxing skills. Daniel replied diplomatically. The specific applications of those skills weren't discussed in detail. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that the questions were designed to create a record that could be used to restructure the narrative around Victoria's boxing development. His employment at the Harbor Club depended on maintaining Victoria's satisfaction while avoiding institutional liability for whatever competitive disasters her overconfidence might produce. The concern, Amanda explained with legal precision, is that Ms. Sterling may have been provided with training that gave her unrealistic expectations about her competitive readiness. If she proceeds to enter boxing competitions based on those expectations, the potential liability implications for the Harbor Club could be significant. Daniel understood immediately that Victoria's response to Sarah Martinez's honest assessment had been to shift responsibility for her limitations onto the training regimen rather than accept the need for additional development. By questioning Daniel's qualifications and Jake's methods, Victoria could maintain her confidence while creating legal protection for whatever competitive misadventures she might pursue. What specific concerns have been raised? Daniel asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal more about Victoria's psychological state than legitimate training issues. Amanda consulted her notes with bureaucratic thoroughness. Ms. Sterling has indicated that her recent sparring session with Ms. Martinez revealed significant gaps in her preparation that she attributes to inadequate training intensity and unrealistic sparring conditions. She's concerned that her previous training partners may have been too accommodating, preventing her from developing the skills necessary for competitive boxing. The irony was profound. Victoria was criticizing the diplomatic approach that had protected her confidence and enabled her progress, apparently preferring to believe that her limitations resulted from insufficient challenge rather than the natural learning curve that boxing development required. Daniel recognized the psychological pattern from military training situations where soldiers sometimes blamed their instructors for failures that resulted from their own unrealistic expectations. Ms. Sterling is welcome to seek training elsewhere if she feels our methods aren't meeting her needs, Daniel replied, understanding that the conversation was really about creating documentation for whatever legal challenges might emerge from Victoria's future boxing activities. Unfortunately, Amanda continued, the situation is more complicated than simple dissatisfaction with training methods. Ms. Sterling is considering pursuing competitive boxing, and she's asked us to review whether her current training regimen has adequately prepared her for that level of competition. If we determine that it hasn't, there could be liability issues related to our facility's role in her preparation. Daniel realized that Victoria's boxing aspirations had evolved beyond personal hobby into potential legal nightmare for everyone involved. If she entered competitions and suffered injuries or embarrassing defeats, she might seek to hold her training partners and the Harbor Club responsible for inadequate preparation, rather than accept that her competitive readiness required significantly more development. The meeting concluded with Amanda requesting written statements from both Daniel and Jake documenting their training methods and Victoria's progress, materials that would presumably be used to construct legal defenses for whatever complications Victoria's boxing ambitions might create. As Daniel prepared to leave the Harbor Club for what might be the final time, she understood that her involvement in Victoria's boxing journey was ending, not because of training completion, but because of institutional recognition that Victoria's delusions had become too dangerous to enable further. His Bible-AD, the carefully managed environment that had allowed Victoria to develop genuine skills while maintaining unrealistic confidence, was being dismantled by legal concerns and Victoria's inability to accept honest assessment of her limitations. Daniel's role as diplomatic sparring partner was no longer sustainable in a situation where authentic feedback had become a liability issue rather than a training tool. The underground gym occupied the basement of Murphy's Bar on the east side of Riverview City, where the Harbor Club's marble floors and crystal chandeliers gave way to concrete walls, exposed pipes, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that serious fighters recognized immediately. Daniel had never intended to return to competitive boxing environments, but Maria Santos's urgent phone call had carried the kind of desperation that military veterans understood as a call for backup. "She's lost her mind," Maria explained as they descended the narrow stairs that led to the makeshift training facility. "Victoria Sterling showed up here 3 days ago with a briefcase full of cash, demanding to schedule sparring sessions with real fighters who wouldn't hold back. She's convinced that her problems at the Harbor Club resulted from overprotective training partners rather than her own limitations." The basement gym was everything the Harbor Club wasn't: cramped, poorly ventilated, and equipped with heavy bags that had been repaired multiple times rather than replaced. But the atmosphere carried an authenticity that expensive facilities couldn't purchase: the accumulated energy of fighters who had earned their skills through repetition, pain, and the kind of honest assessment that Victoria had been systematically avoiding. "How much cash are we talking about?" Daniel asked, though she suspected the answer would explain why Murphy's Bar had been willing to accommodate someone whose presence would normally be discouraged by the gym's regular clientele. $5,000, Maria replied with the incredulity of someone who had never seen that much money offered for boxing services. She wants to schedule sessions with legitimate competitors, people who have actual fight records, and won't adjust their intensity based on her comfort level. Murphy took the money because business has been slow, but he's starting to worry about liability issues if she gets seriously hurt. Daniel examined the gym's setup with professional interest, noting immediately that the environment was designed for serious training rather than recreational fitness. The ring was regulation size with minimal padding, the heavy bags were weighted for maximum resistance, and the general configuration prioritized function over safety in ways that would expose skill gaps immediately. "Who's she been sparring with?" Daniel asked, dreading the answer. "Tommy Rodriguez from the community center, Lisa Chen who fights amateur competitions, and yesterday she went 3 rounds with Angela Martinez, Sarah's younger sister who just turned professional." Maria's voice carried the concern of someone who understood that Victoria's escalating opposition was creating increasingly dangerous mismatches. The progression was alarming. Victoria had moved from carefully managed sessions with Daniel to legitimate competitive fighters, whose skills and intensity would provide none of the accommodation that had enabled her gradual progress. Daniel recognized the psychological pattern from military training disasters, where overconfident soldiers demanded advanced challenges before mastering basic skills, usually with catastrophic results. "How did those sessions go?" Daniel asked, though she suspected the answer would confirm her worst concerns about Victoria's trajectory. "About as well as you'd expect," Maria replied grimly. "Tommy went easy on her for the first round, then increased pressure when she demanded real intensity. She lasted maybe 30 seconds before he backed off voluntarily. Said he was worried about hurting someone who clearly wasn't ready for competitive-level sparring." The scenario confirmed Daniel's assessment that Victoria's confidence had become completely disconnected from her actual capabilities. The careful balance between challenge and safety that had characterized their Harbor Club sessions had been replaced by Victoria's determination to prove herself against opposition that wouldn't provide diplomatic accommodation. "Where is she now?" Daniel asked. recognizing that the situation had moved beyond simple training complications into territories that could result in serious injury if not managed carefully. Upstairs in Murphy's office, arguing with him about scheduling more sessions, Maria replied. She is convinced that she just needs to find fighters who will take her seriously, instead of holding back. She doesn't seem to understand that they are taking her seriously enough to avoid actually hurting her. Daniel climbed the stairs from the basement gym with the tactical awareness that military training had ingrained, understanding that she was entering a situation where competing interests and escalating tensions could create unpredictable complications. Victoria's voice was audible through Murphy's office door, carrying the frustrated authority of someone whose will was being questioned by people she considered subordinates. "I'm paying premium rates for authentic sparring sessions," Victoria was saying with obvious irritation. "If your fighters aren't willing to provide genuine competition, then I'll find ones who are. There are other gyms in this city that would appreciate the business." Murphy's response carried the weary patience of someone who had spent decades managing difficult personalities in environments where ego and violence intersected unpredictably. "Miss Sterling, my fighters are providing genuine competition. The problem isn't their intensity. It's the mismatch between your expectations and your current skill level. You need more foundational training before attempting competitive-level sparring." "That's exactly the kind of overprotective attitude that's been limiting my development," Victoria replied with escalating frustration. "I've been training seriously for months. I've shown measurable improvement in every session. The idea that I need more foundational training is just another way of saying that you don't think I can handle real competition." Daniel knocked on the office door, understanding that intervention was necessary before Victoria's determination to prove herself resulted in someone getting seriously hurt. The conversation paused, and Murphy's gruff voice called for her to enter. Victoria's reaction to seeing Daniel was immediate and hostile, her expression shifting from frustrated determination to accusations of betrayal. "What are you doing here? Are you following me? I suppose the Harbor Club sent you to convince me that I need to return to their sanitized training environment." "Actually," Daniel replied calmly, "Maria called me because she's worried about your safety. The fighters you're requesting to spar with are legitimate competitors whose training intensity could seriously injure someone who isn't adequately prepared." "Adequately prepared?" Victoria's voice rose with indignation. "I've been training consistently for months. I've shown improvement in every measurable category. The only thing I haven't been adequately prepared for is fighting people who actually fight back instead of managing my confidence like I'm some kind of fragile amateur." Murphy intervened with the authority of someone whose gym had seen its share of conflicts between ego and reality. "Ms. Sterling, Daniel's right to be concerned. The fighters you want to train with compete at levels that require years of development. Angela Martinez has been boxing since she was 12. She's got 15 years of experience and a professional record. Asking to spar with her at competitive intensity is like asking to race Formula One drivers because you've been practicing in a parking lot." The comparison was apt but unwelcome, triggering Victoria's defensive response to any suggestion that her progress had been insufficient to justify her competitive aspirations. "I understand that other fighters have more experience, but experience isn't everything. Natural talent, dedication, and proper training can overcome experience gaps if the commitment is genuine." Daniel recognized the dangerous combination of partial truth and complete delusion that characterized Victoria's current mindset. Some aspects of boxing could indeed be accelerated through intensive training and natural ability, but the fundamental experience base that competitive fighting required couldn't be compressed into months of even dedicated practice. "Victoria," Daniel said carefully, "what you've accomplished over the past few months is genuinely impressive. But competitive boxing requires specific preparation that goes beyond technical skill development. The psychological and physical demands are different from training environments, regardless of how realistic we try to make the practice sessions." "So what are you suggesting?" Victoria demanded. "That I return to the Harbor Club and continue playing pretend with sparring partners who are more concerned about my feelings than my development? That I accept that I'll never be ready for real competition because people like you think I should know my place?" The accusation revealed the deeper psychological dynamics driving Victoria's escalating demands, her interpretation of honest assessment as discrimination, her conflation of realistic evaluation with personal limitation, her belief that institutional resistance to her boxing aspirations reflected prejudice rather than professional judgment. Daniel realized that rational argument wouldn't address Victoria's fundamental misconception about the nature of competitive preparation. Victoria had convinced herself that the obstacles she was encountering represented external limitations rather than internal development needs, creating a psychological framework that interpreted every cautionary voice as another barrier to overcome through determination rather than evidence that additional preparation might be necessary. The basement gym waited below them, equipped with regulation equipment and populated by fighters whose skills would provide exactly the kind of uncompromising assessment that Victoria claimed to want. But Daniel understood that what Victoria was really seeking wasn't honest evaluation. It was validation of her belief that months of managed progress had prepared her for competitive challenges that typically required years of systematic development. The Riverside Community Center's main gymnasium had been transformed into an arena that captured the attention of everyone who understood that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Word had spread through social media that Victoria Sterling, the billionaire CEO who claimed she could box, would finally face authentic opposition in a public demonstration that would settle questions about her abilities once and for all. Daniel stood near the entrance, watching the crowd gather with the tactical awareness that military service had ingrained. The audience represented a cross-section of Riverview City society, Harbor Club members who had come to witness either Victoria's vindication or humiliation, local boxing enthusiasts curious about the wealthy amateur's actual skills, and media representatives drawn by the spectacle of extreme wealth colliding with working-class authenticity. Victoria had orchestrated the event herself after Murphy's Gym refused to accommodate her demands for increasingly dangerous sparring partners. Her solution was characteristically direct: rent a public venue, hire legitimate opponents, and create a forum where her skills could be demonstrated without the protective limitations that she blamed for her previous setbacks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced from the center of the makeshift ring, her voice carrying the confident authority that had made her legendary in corporate boardrooms, "tonight represents the culmination of months of dedicated training and the opportunity to demonstrate what's possible when commitment meets authentic instruction." The announcement was vintage Victoria, framing the event as evidence of her achievement rather than a test of her capabilities, positioning potential failure as the result of inadequate previous training rather than natural limitations. Daniel recognized the psychological strategy from military leadership training, where officers sometimes redefine mission parameters to ensure that any outcome could be interpreted as success. Rebecca Walsh sat ringside with the professional detachment of someone whose investment decision would be determined by what she observed over the next hour. Her presence added legitimacy to the proceedings while creating pressure for results that would justify months of speculation about Victoria's boxing league concept and her potential as a competitive athlete. The first opponent was Carmen Rodriguez, a local amateur with solid fundamentals and enough competitive experience to provide genuine resistance without the overwhelming skill level that would make the mismatch dangerous. Daniel had suggested Carmen specifically because her straightforward style would test Victoria's adaptive abilities without the complexity that advanced fighters brought to competitive situations. "This should be interesting," Rebecca commented to Daniel as Victoria completed her elaborate warm-up routine. "Carmen's got good basics and won't adjust her intensity based on her opponent's comfort level. If Victoria's training has been legitimate, she should be able to handle 3 rounds of honest amateur-level competition." Daniel nodded, though her assessment was more nuanced than Rebecca's optimistic framing suggested. Victoria's improvement over the past months had been real but relative. Impressive compared to her starting point, but potentially inadequate for the kind of sustained pressure that even amateur competition demanded. The controlled sparring sessions that had enabled her progress couldn't fully replicate the psychological and physical demands of facing an opponent whose primary goal was winning rather than education. The opening bell brought immediate clarity to questions that months of diplomatic sparring had obscured. Carmen approached the center of the ring with workmanlike efficiency, throwing basic combinations with the kind of technical competence that separated recreational boxers from competitive athletes. Victoria's response revealed immediately that her training had prepared her for cooperative exchange rather than genuine combat. Carmen's first serious combination, a simple jab-cross-hook sequence, exposed fundamental gaps in Victoria's defensive preparation. The techniques that had worked against Daniel's carefully controlled attacks proved inadequate when facing an opponent whose timing and intensity weren't adjusted for Victoria's comfort level. Victoria's attempt to counter resulted in awkward footwork and defensive positioning that left her vulnerable to follow-up attacks. She's struggling with the pace, Rebecca observed, making notes with the clinical detachment that suggested her investment evaluation was shifting in real time. Her technique is decent, but she's not adapting to pressure that doesn't follow the patterns she's trained against. The observation highlighted the central problem with Victoria's preparation. Her skills had developed within parameters that prioritized gradual improvement over authentic readiness. When those parameters were removed, the limitations became immediately apparent to anyone who understood competitive boxing fundamentals. By the end of the first round, Victoria was breathing heavily. Her perfect form deteriorated by the psychological pressure of facing someone whose skills genuinely exceeded her own. Carmen had controlled the pace and distance throughout the round, demonstrating the kind of ring generalship that competitive experience provided and recreational training couldn't replicate. "How do you think I'm doing?" Victoria asked Rebecca during the brief rest period, her confidence visibly shaken by the gap between her expectations and her performance. Rebecca's response was diplomatically honest in ways that Victoria's previous feedback had carefully avoided. "You're showing good heart, and your technique holds up under pressure better than I expected. But Carmen is controlling the tactical aspects of the fight, distance, timing, pace, in ways that suggest significant experience advantages." Victoria's face showed the exact moment when months of carefully maintained confidence encountered authentic professional assessment. But instead of accepting the feedback as information for future development, her expression shifted towards something approaching defiance. "I think I'm just taking time to adjust to her style," Victoria replied with determined optimism. "Every opponent presents different challenges. This is exactly the kind of experience I needed to develop my competitive instincts." The second round began with Victoria attempting to increase her aggression, apparently interpreting her first-round struggles as evidence that she needed to be more assertive rather than more skilled. The strategy backfired immediately. Increased aggression without corresponding increases in technical ability typically resulted in wider openings for counterattacks, precisely what Carmen exploited with clinical efficiency. Carmen's counterpunching became more pronounced as Victoria's defensive discipline deteriorated under pressure. Each exchange revealed more clearly that Victoria's months of training had created enough skill to appear competent in controlled environments, but insufficient preparation for the sustained tactical pressure that even amateur competition demanded. "This is getting concerning," Daniel murmured to Maria, who had positioned herself near the ring apron in case intervention became necessary. "Victoria is not adapting to the tactical reality. She's trying to impose her trained combinations on a situation that requires reactive adjustment." Maria nodded grimly, recognizing the signs of a fighter whose confidence had become dangerously disconnected from their actual capabilities. "Should we stop it?" "Not yet," Daniel replied, though her assessment was based more on Victoria's pride than her safety. "Let her see what authentic competition feels like. Sometimes, that's the only way to bridge the gap between perception and reality." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Harbor Club members seemed torn between support for their peer and recognition that the demonstration wasn't unfolding as Victoria had anticipated. Local boxing enthusiasts watched with the kind of respectful attention that genuine effort always commanded, regardless of skill level, while media representatives documented what was clearly becoming a story about the limits of purchased expertise rather than its validation. As the second round concluded with Carmen firmly in control of every tactical aspect of the contest, Daniel realized that the evening would ultimately determine not just Victoria's competitive readiness, but her psychological ability to process honest feedback about achievements that had been months in the making. The public nature of the assessment would make denial considerably more difficult than it had been in private training sessions, creating an opportunity for authentic self-evaluation that Victoria had been systematically avoiding. The final round would reveal whether Victoria possessed the psychological resilience to accept that genuine achievement required longer development periods than her confidence had suggested, or whether public failure would trigger even more dangerous overcompensation in her pursuit of competitive validation. The third round began with Victoria's corner providing advice that revealed the fundamental disconnect between her preparation and the reality she was facing. Jake Rodriguez, who had been summoned despite their complicated professional relationship, spoke with the careful diplomacy that had characterized their entire training partnership, offering technical suggestions that assumed Victoria could implement tactical adjustments under pressure that she had never practiced in controlled environments. "Box smart, use your jab to control distance, don't chase her when she moves." Jake instructed with professional competence, though Daniel could see in his expression the recognition that months of choreographed sparring hadn't prepared Victoria for the kind of real-time tactical thinking that competitive boxing demanded. Victoria nodded with determined confidence, but her implementation of Jake's advice immediately demonstrated the gap between understanding concepts intellectually and applying them under the psychological pressure that Carmen's legitimate skills provided. Her jab, which had looked crisp and effective during training sessions, became arm punches, thrown without proper footwork or timing. Telegraphed movements that Carmen could see developing and counter with relative ease. The crowd's energy shifted as the mismatch became increasingly apparent to everyone present. What had begun as anticipation for competitive drama evolved into the kind of respectful silence that sporting events generated when effort exceeded ability by margins too significant to ignore politely. Harbor Club members exchanged glances that mixed sympathy for Victoria's obvious dedication with embarrassment at the public exposure of limitations that private training had concealed. Carmen, to her credit, fought with the professional discipline that serious amateur boxers developed through competitive experience. She controlled distance and pace without showboating, demonstrated superior technique without unnecessary aggression, and generally conducted herself with the kind of respectful competence that made Victoria's struggles appear educational rather than humiliating. But Victoria's response to tactical pressure revealed psychological patterns that Daniel recognized from military training situations, where overconfident soldiers encountered challenges that exceeded their preparation. Instead of adapting her approach based on real-time feedback, Victoria increased her intensity in ways that multiplied her tactical mistakes while exposing her to more effective counterattacks. "She's not processing the information the fight is giving her," Rebecca Walsh observed to Daniel during a brief clinch that provided momentary respite from the tactical clinic Carmen was conducting. "Good fighters adapt their approach based on what's working and what isn't. Victoria seems to be trying harder to make her trained techniques work rather than adjusting to what the situation demands." The observation highlighted the fundamental difference between recreational training and competitive preparation. Victoria's months of development had focused on perfecting predetermined responses to anticipated situations, while Carmen's experience base included the kind of adaptive problem-solving that authentic competition required. When predetermined responses proved inadequate, Victoria had no alternative framework for tactical adjustment. The turning point came midway through the third round, when Victoria attempted a combination that had been successful during training sessions with Daniel, but proved catastrophically inappropriate against Carmen's defensive positioning. Victoria's right cross, thrown with full commitment but poor timing, met Carmen's counter left hook in an exchange that demonstrated the difference between choreographed sparring and genuine competition with brutal clarity. Victoria staggered backward, not from the impact of Carmen's punch, which had been pulled significantly at the last moment, but from the psychological shock of encountering resistance that her training hadn't prepared her to handle. The moment represented the collision between months of carefully managed progress and the uncompromising reality that competitive boxing provided, even at amateur levels. "Are you okay to continue?" the referee asked, examining Victoria for signs of injury, while really assessing her psychological state after the reality check that Carmen's superior skills had provided. Victoria's response revealed everything about her character that Daniel had observed during their training relationship. Instead of accepting the evidence that she needed additional preparation before pursuing competitive boxing, Victoria's expression shifted towards something approaching desperate determination, the look of someone who had invested too much pride in an outcome to accept honest assessment of their readiness. "I'm fine," Victoria replied with forced confidence, though her body language suggested recognition that the evening wasn't unfolding according to her expectations. "Just got caught with a good shot, that's boxing." The final minutes of the round provided a masterclass in the difference between technical competence and competitive application. Carmen continued to demonstrate superior ring generalship, controlling distance and pace, while providing Victoria with enough opportunity to display her trained techniques without creating situations that could result in serious injury. It was coaching through competition, education delivered through tactical superiority rather than verbal instruction. Victoria's performance during these final exchanges revealed both the legitimate progress she had made and the significant limitations that remained. Her technique, while fundamentally sound, lacked the fluidity that allowed skilled fighters to adapt their approach based on changing circumstances. Her conditioning, though adequate for training sessions, proved insufficient for the sustained mental and physical demands that even amateur competition required. When the final bell sounded, the result was clear to everyone present, though Victoria's immediate reaction suggested that acceptance wouldn't come easily. Carmen had controlled every tactical aspect of the contest, demonstrating superior skills while showing enough restraint to prevent the mismatch from becoming dangerous. Victoria had shown heart and technical competence but had been thoroughly outclassed by an opponent whose experience base exceeded her own by margins that months of additional training couldn't bridge quickly. Rebecca Walsh's assessment was immediate and professionally definitive. "Victoria, you've obviously worked very hard and shown real improvement in your technical skills. But tonight demonstrated that competitive boxing requires experience bases that take years to develop, not months." Carmen's tactical advantages weren't the result of superior natural ability. They reflected competitive experience that recreational training can't replicate. Victoria's response to this feedback would determine whether the evening represented a valuable learning experience that could inform realistic long-term development goals, or a humiliation that would trigger even more dangerous attempts to prove herself against increasingly inappropriate opposition. Daniel watched Victoria's face carefully, recognizing the psychological crossroads that military training sometimes created when overconfident soldiers encountered evidence that their preparation was insufficient for the challenges they sought to face. The crowd began to disperse with the respectful appreciation that genuine effort always commanded, regardless of outcome. Victoria had shown courage in accepting the challenge and dignity in facing superior opposition, but the evening had definitively answered questions about her competitive readiness that months of diplomatic training had carefully avoided addressing. As Victoria stood in the center of the ring, breathing heavily and processing feedback that contradicted everything her confidence had suggested about her capabilities, Daniel understood that the real test would be Victoria's response to authentic assessment rather than her performance against Carmen's superior skills. Some people grew from honest evaluation, while others retreated into denial that could create even more dangerous situations if competitive ambitions remained unchanged by evidence of current limitations. 6 months later, the transformation was evident in ways that extended far beyond boxing technique into territories of character and perspective that Daniel recognized as the authentic achievements that competitive challenges could provide when approached with proper humility. Victoria Sterling stood in the renovated basement of Murphy's Bar, now officially designated as the Sterling Community Boxing Center, watching a group of teenage girls practice combinations with the kind of focused attention that genuine teaching required. The renovation had been Victoria's idea, though the implementation reflected input from everyone who had been involved in her boxing journey. Daniel's insights about functional training environments, Maria's understanding of community needs, and Murphy's practical knowledge about sustainable gym operations. The result was a facility that combined the Harbor Club's resources with the authentic atmosphere that serious training demanded. "Keep your guard up, Sarah." Victoria called to a 15-year-old who was working through the same defensive problems that Victoria herself had struggled with during her early training. Boxing isn't about looking perfect. It's about developing habits that work under pressure. Daniel watched from the observation area, marveling at the evolution in Victoria's coaching philosophy that reflected genuine understanding of skill development rather than the performance-focused approach that had characterized her own early training. The woman who had once demanded immediate competitive readiness now demonstrated patience with gradual progress that suggested authentic appreciation for the complexities that boxing mastery required. The community center served a population that the Harbor Club would never reach: working-class families whose children needed structured activities, single mothers like Daniel who understood the value of physical confidence, and teenagers who were attracted to boxing's combination of individual challenge and community support. Victoria's financial investment had made the programs possible, but her personal involvement had made them sustainable in ways that simple charity couldn't achieve. "How's Emma adapting to the new apartment?" Victoria asked during a break between training sessions, referring to the 2-bedroom unit above the community center that Daniel and her daughter now called home. The arrangement was part of Daniel's compensation package as head instructor, providing both financial stability and proximity to work that had transformed their family's security situation. "She loves having space for homework and friends," Daniel replied, though the benefits extended beyond simple square footage into emotional territories that stable housing provided. Emma's grades had improved dramatically once her living situation became predictable, and her friendship with Victoria's nephew, who attended the after-school program, had given her social connections that transcended economic boundaries. The boxing program had evolved into something more comprehensive than simple athletic training, incorporating academic support, mentorship opportunities, and the kind of community building that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. Victoria's business background had proven invaluable for organizational development, while Daniel's military experience provided structure and discipline that kept programs focused on measurable outcomes rather than good intentions. Rebecca Walsh wants to schedule another evaluation visit next month, Victoria mentioned, referring to the investor whose initial skepticism had evolved into genuine interest as the community center demonstrated sustainable impact. She's considering expanding the model to other cities if our metrics continue showing positive results. That weekend, Carmen and Diego visited Henderson Manufacturing, where she maintained an office and continued mentoring the employee engagement initiatives that had launched her career. The building looked the same from the outside, but the workplace culture had been transformed beyond recognition. The employee suggestion system that had once consisted of an ignored metal box now featured digital platforms, regular listening sessions, and systematic implementation of worker-identified improvements. The meditation corner she'd established had evolved into a comprehensive wellness center, with resources for stress management, continuing education, and peer support networks. Most importantly, Henderson Manufacturing had become a model for family-friendly employment practices that attracted talented people from across the region. The company's reputation for supporting working parents, accommodating caregiving responsibilities, and recognizing the full humanity of their workforce had made it an employer of choice for professionals seeking workplaces that honored their complete lives. Elena Santos, the former night custodian who had been promoted to facilities coordination manager, greeted Carmen with warm enthusiasm. "Carmen, the new employee orientation program you designed is working beautifully. New hires consistently say they've never experienced workplace training that addresses both professional development and personal wellness." As Carmen walked through spaces where she had once moved invisibly, she encountered dozens of employees whose lives had been improved by policies that recognized workers as whole human beings rather than production units. Single parents who could participate in school events without jeopardizing their careers. Employees pursuing education who received scheduling flexibility and tuition support. Workers managing elderly care responsibilities who found understanding rather than discrimination. The revolution that had begun with Carmen's desperate job search had proven definitively that treating employees well generated superior business results while creating competitive advantages that traditional management approaches couldn't match. That evening, as Carmen helped Diego with his bedtime routine, he asked a question that captured the essence of everything they had accomplished together. "Mama, do you think other kids like me will have easier lives because of the work you do?" Carmen kissed her son's forehead, thinking about the scholarship fund that now supported 847 families, the workplace policies that accommodated thousands of caregivers, and the cultural shift that was gradually making corporate America more humane. "I think so, mi amor. I think your story is going to help lots of families find better opportunities." "Good," Diego said with the matter-of-fact satisfaction he brought to solved problems. "Everyone deserves to have their mama come home happy from work." The gentle heart that had sparked a corporate revolution belonged not just to Carmen and Diego, but to every family that refused to accept that love and livelihood had to be competing priorities. Their story had proven that authentic leadership could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the most valuable employees might be those who brought their complete humanity to work rather than hiding inconvenient aspects of their lives. The broken cleaning cartwheel, now displayed in Carmen's office as a reminder of how small acts of kindness could create profound change, had become a symbol of possibility that inspired business leaders worldwide to recognize human potential in unconventional packages. Corporate America would never be the same, and that transformation had begun with one mother's midnight phone call and a CEO wise enough to recognize that her gentle heart contained exactly the leadership qualities his company and the business world desperately needed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The metrics were indeed impressive. Attendance rates that exceeded projections, academic improvement among participating students, and community engagement levels that suggested the program was addressing needs beyond simple athletic instruction. But Daniel recognized that the real success was evident in less quantifiable ways. The confidence that teenage girls displayed after months of training, the pride that parents showed when discussing their children's achievements, and the sense of community ownership that had developed around the facility. Victoria's personal transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the program's success. The woman who had once insisted on competitive validation despite obvious limitations had evolved into someone whose satisfaction came from enabling others' development rather than demonstrating her own achievements. Her boxing skills had continued improving through consistent training, but her goals had shifted from personal recognition to community impact. "I've been thinking about entering the Golden Gloves tournament in the Masters division," Victoria mentioned casually, though Daniel detected the careful way she introduced the topic that suggested significant internal debate. "Not because I think I'm ready to win, but because the training process might be valuable for understanding what we're preparing our advanced students for." Daniel considered the suggestion carefully, recognizing both the progress Victoria had made and the realistic assessment that competitive boxing still represented a significant challenge for someone whose athletic development had begun in her 40s. But Victoria's motivation seemed genuinely educational rather than ego-driven, focused on improving her coaching effectiveness rather than proving personal capabilities. "That could be valuable," Daniel agreed, "especially if you approach it as research rather than validation. The tournament experience would give you insights into competitive preparation that would benefit our program development." The conversation was interrupted by Carmen Rodriguez, who had become a regular volunteer instructor after her sparring session with Victoria had evolved into an ongoing mentorship relationship. Carmen's presence provided competitive credibility, while her teaching style offered technical expertise that complemented Daniel's military-influenced approach to training structure. "The evening session is getting pretty crowded," Carmen reported with obvious satisfaction. "We've got 23 people signed up for tonight's class, including several new members who heard about the program from social media coverage." The social media coverage had been overwhelmingly positive, focusing on the community center's impact rather than Victoria's personal boxing journey. Stories about teenage girls finding confidence through training, single mothers developing physical fitness habits, and community members connecting across economic boundaries had generated the kind of authentic publicity that reflected genuine value creation rather than manufactured interest. Victoria's corporate background had been invaluable for developing sustainable funding models that combined private investment with community support, creating financial stability that wasn't dependent solely on her personal contributions. The center operated as a social enterprise that generated enough revenue through membership fees and program tuition to cover operational costs, while maintaining accessibility for families who couldn't afford full rates. "I have some news," Victoria announced as the evening session concluded and the staff gathered for their weekly planning meeting. "Meridian Financial has approved my proposal to establish a foundation that will support boxing programs in underserved communities throughout the region. The initial funding will allow us to replicate this model in 5 additional cities over the next 2 years." Daniel felt genuine excitement at the expansion possibilities, recognizing that Victoria's business skills combined with proven program effectiveness could create opportunities for families who face challenges similar to those she and Emma had experienced. The foundation model would provide sustainable funding while maintaining local community ownership of individual programs. As they locked up the community center that evening, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate financial circumstances to meaningful community leadership. Victoria's boxing delusions had ultimately created opportunities that conventional employment might never have provided, demonstrating that sometimes the most unexpected encounters generated the most significant positive changes. Victoria had never become the competitive boxer she'd initially envisioned, but she had achieved something more valuable, the kind of authentic impact that came from using resources and determination to address genuine community needs rather than personal validation. Her transformation from delusional amateur to effective community leader represented the kind of character development that authentic challenges could produce when approached with proper humility and realistic goal setting. The Sterling Community Boxing Center stood as testament to the possibility that failed personal ambitions could sometimes evolve into successful community investments, that authentic achievement often looked different from initial expectations, and that the most valuable victories sometimes came from enabling others' success rather than pursuing individual recognition. As Daniel walked home to the apartment where Emma was probably finishing homework with the security that stable housing provided, she understood that their family's story had become part of something larger, a community transformation that began with one woman's boxing delusions but evolved into sustainable impact that would benefit families for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, You won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.